right. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for listening to New England Horror Files podcast. We are up late because we're unclear. Tonight, we're going to be talking about spectral evidence and why it's so deeply horrifying, and also how it shows up in early New England history. So, Em, tell me, you've been looking into this a bit. So, tell me a bit about spectral evidence. If you could just kind of define that, go into a little bit how that's shaped our region's history.
Sure thing, Jay. So, spectral evidence is a type of testimony.
What are you, an anchor woman? Sure thing, guy. Spectral evidence has been seen in the downtown areas as well as uptown over by the Civic Center. Nothing in Midtown yet, but we'll keep you posted as it develops.
When did you become so professional?
Oh my God.
Okay. Okay.
Anyways, we'll lighten it up a bit.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, Jay, spectral evidence is a type of testimony where a witness claims to have seen the spirit or specter of an accused person harming them in a dream or a vision, often used in witch trials. But it's not just someone harming them. It's like using a vision or a ghost story, if you will, or I saw the spirit of so-and-so, or I saw the devil, anything like that, like visions or dreams or, that kind of stuff. That's kind of the general idea of what spectral evidence is.
Yeah.
I think you see this the most in, now, we're not going to get into the Salem witch trials. We're not going there in this episode. However, that is where you will see spectral evidence, like historically, like everybody knows that. If you know anything about the Salem witch trials, you know that they were based almost entirely on the use of spectral evidence in court. So I'm trying to get the numbers because I always forget how many people were actually. I mean, this court generally.
I'm not sure either.
Yeah,
I visited a couple years back, and I think it was like 20 or like something like that. They have like the mass grave, or like, and it's not the mass grave. It's like a memorial.
Right. Where's the darn?
I'm sure more.
Right. Yeah. Well, there were. I think it was 19 that actually were executed by hanging, and then one was with the pressing with the rock. So that's 20. And then there were, there were actually many more brought to court. Over 200 people were accused.
Right.
30 were found guilty. 19 were hanged. 4 people died in jail, and one man, Giles Corey, died due to the torture of pressing. He was crushed. Oh God, can you I think back. Just let's pause and just think about what it would be like in Salem in 1692 to be crushed to death by a freaking stone. Do you know what I mean? Anywho, so the thing with the Salem witch trials is this went on for a time until the wife of the governor was accused, and then he said no more spectral, or they said no more spectral evidence, and then miraculously they had nothing to go on, and the trials eventually ended because without the spectral evidence they had nothing, so there was no actual real evidence. This was the bulk of the testimony, the bulk of the what people were being accused by.
Yeah. Well, and just to anyone listening, we say we're not talking about Salem witch trials, and then we proceed to talk about the Salem witch trials. What we mean is we're not going into great detail about it.
Right.
It's not what the episode's about, but it's relevant to the theme of spectral evidence being used in our Massachusetts history. But we're not going to go deep into that, and I think we probably will at some point. I think that could be
a
episode or even
we have to for sure.
But yeah, so basically, from what I understand, it's like we have people saying more or less, "Oh, I saw I saw so and so with the devil in my dreams, or so and so came to me and told me that so and so was a worshiper of them, or like these type of things, like you know,
Right.
people claiming things that happened in dreams, or thoughts or whatever like that.
Well, I think too, it's also important to remember that this was, Puritan Massachusetts, and the Puritan beliefs, like they were very much like, I mean, very much like what's that movie, The Witch?
The witch. I was just thinking about the witch. Yeah.
Very much, yeah, very much that sort of like
God.
physical realities had spiritual causes. So like, if the mules died, there was the devil. It was because you had, you know,
Sin.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And there's so many branches of religion going on, like with Puritan and then Anglicans and Quakers. Like I don't claim to know the exact ins and outs, but I do know that Puritans, it was very much like that. Like you were born with, I believe the Puritans where you were born with the sin, and like you're constantly trying to, get away from that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. But I do know that they had that very
You could be
much.
right. They were very strict in terms of those sorts of things.
Right.
Um,
So
I'm
it
not. I'm
is.
not sure. I'm not. Exactly aware of all the different sects of Christianity, Catholicism, etc. So
Right. So it's just that in this time period that this was very much a thought in a lot of the I mean, Massachusetts was the first major. Well, it was like at the time it was a big colony. There was lots of people there. Like people were flocking there in great numbers, and a lot of them were Puritan. So this at the time was a lot of the belief, the spiritual beliefs of a lot of people. So nowadays, well, I mean, things might be different. This is the thought process back then. So it makes sense when you look at it in that context. So which brings us to
which,
oh my god.
but no, actually, it's funny. You mentioned the witch, and that's really just a perfect example of one. I mean, coming from like New England horror fans such as ourselves, that's got to be like that's a top tier New England horror film right there. That's one of my personal favorites. I can't even watch that movie if it's dark out. Um, it just, but that is like the theme in that movie is just so evil, because if
Mm,
if you haven't seen it, it's basically about um, a family in Puritan era New England. It's just stated as New England. It's not specifically
yeah,
Massachusetts. I don't believe.
it's kind of
Um,
ambiguous.
but they're exiled, so they go and they move out into the woods, and they build a small farm and whatnot, and then just things start happening to them. Things start happening to the family, and they're very. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I thought I heard something. I was just making sure I was still on. Okay, cool.
No, you're
So
good.
so things start happening to like the livestock, and you know
The
people get
baby.
injured and like kidnapped and this sort of thing. And it's very sinister, and the family starts believing that the there's like a witch in the woods, and obviously I hate to give the spoiler away, but there is. Um, um,
Turns out, yes, there's a
Turns
witch in the
out
woods.
the witch is about, yes, it can has a witch living in the woods. Um, but I'm gonna give it an actual spoiler away. So if you haven't seen the movie, I mean, it's been like 10 years at least, so I don't feel bad. But like, spoiler alert, mute me now if you want to watch the movie first.
Fast forward.
But long story short, at the end, everybody in the family dies except for the young daughter, who's about 15 or so, 15 or 16, I want to say. And what really got me about that was that she was like the most, she was very, throughout the movie, she was very religious. She was very, what's the word?
Hmm.
What's the word I'm looking
Devout.
for? Devout, yes, very devout. That's the word I'm looking for. And at the end, she has this situation where like, what is she going to do? Because she could go back to town and she'd probably be labeled a witch if she was to um,
Right.
you know say the
Explain the
word,
situation.
explain the situation. Yeah. So what ends up happening is she goes into the woods and joins the witch and does in fact become a witch. But
Right.
it just obviously it's a fictional story and what have you, but it's a New England horror channel, so I mean, yeah, obviously
Yeah, that's New England horror.
it's on
What
the
I
top.
loved, as a sidebar, what I loved about that movie. Okay, so first, I actually spoiled it for myself. Like, I watched before I watched the movie, I watched commentary about it.
Yep.
So like, I did that before watching it. So everything was spoiled for me. But I couldn't, like, the way that they talked was very much,
Old
very true.
English, yeah.
Right, it's very true to the time period. So like,
Yeah.
and
You have
it's
to
very
follow.
much,
You have
yeah.
to follow it. It takes a bit of
I
focus.
had to put the subtitles on, to be honest, but I didn't actually make it through that whole movie because I had ruined it for myself. I was like, gosh darn it, I can't even watch them.
Oh wow,
This is
wow.
supposed to be one of the best movies, and I already know what happens. Like, I ruined it for myself. So,
Yeah.
but these concepts of, like, the good and the evil and the prayer and the baby disappeared because the God is punishing us for our misdeeds, and that whole, not like, not persona, but like, those ideas are represented very well there.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, this is like, people getting exiled for going against the church, and like, whatever, that kind of stuff, like, wicked happened, especially in pre-colonial New England. And actually, if it actually does bring us into what we're talking about in as the main character for today's episode is actually not the Salem witch trials, but
Right.
one of the original founders of Portsmouth, or the original mothers of Portsmouth, was a friend of Anne Hutchinson, who was exiled from Massachusetts for her speaking out against the church as a woman in the 1600s. Um, and this is kind of the story of one of the earlier settlers of Portsmouth, and it involves
Portsmouth, Rhode Island, correct?
Portsmouth, Rhode Island, right?
Okay.
Portsmouth, Rhode Island, or Rhode Island was
Let's talk about that for a minute. Let's talk about Rhode Island was sort of like you. I think you were going to explain it, so I won't cut you. Go ahead.
right. Yeah, that in the 1600s, when this particular story takes place, is actually 1672 to 73, which is before the Salem witch trials. So
Okay.
as for
Yeah.
reference, Newport and the island, it's Aquidneck Island, it's Newport, Middletown, and Portsmouth today, was founded in the late 1630s. So and it was a very, very early colony of Rhode Island, or I'm sorry, early colony of New England. So this is the very beginning of, like, the colonization of America. So Newport was a major trading port. It became a bustling merchant town. I mean, it was huge. It was virtually the capital for a long time before Providence. So it was founded, though, mostly on the concept of religious tolerance. So, like, if you actually go to Newport today, there's every church on the planet is in Newport, and it's very diverse, and it's you can see the history has continued throughout, since it began. So that's a common theme of, Roger Williams was kicked out of Massachusetts, and Hutchinson,
Yep.
I know those are Rhode Island specifically. I find Rhode Island history fascinating. And if you're actually interested in a good podcast about Rhode Island and the history, there's the Story of Rhode Island podcast. You can find that on, I believe he's on YouTube, but he's definitely on Spotify. He's got a Facebook page, Instagram. I mean, I love it. Being from Rhode Island, I love hearing the history. But so yeah, so Newport and Rhode Island were, founded on religious tolerance, which was a radical idea for the time. This was
Yeah.
like unheard of.
Just sidebar. Another good Rhode Island content creator is Jason Allard. You guys want to check him out? He does some
Yes.
interesting videos about different things you wouldn't necessarily know about, but they're like kind of just You never know what's in your backyard sort of stuff. But anyways, that's well researched, kind of well,
He's very good. Yeah.
creative. Anyway,
Hmm.
I wouldn't mind talking with him. He's probably that'd be a good episode. Sidebar.
Actually, yeah, it would. Both of them would be.
Sidebar to my sidebar.
Okay, so the story of Rebecca Cornell of Portsmouth. You want to lead us there with this the 1673 murder of Rebecca Cornell and the Good Fire?
Oh
The
shit.
accused was convicted on the basis of spectral evidence.
Hold on. I gotta go back. My bad. I kind of came up
Oh, it's all right.
quicker than.
So this is a article from the New England Historical Society.com. There's also been stories about this in the Newport Daily News. I find this is I learned about this story. I mean, God, decades ago, and I always found it wicked fascinating. Like, did this really happen? Like, is that like a thing? Like, before I knew anything about history, New England history, I was like, so somebody had a dream and said that in the use this in court, and it worked. Like, it's always been fascinating to me, and I thought it would be good to share it on the podcast. This is also, in the area kind of where we're from, where we grew up, and it's, again, I'm just going to say it again. It's a fascinating story.
Yeah, this is an interesting story. Okay, yeah, I'm just gonna read through this real quick. It's not very long, but yeah. So it's the 1673 murder of Rebecca Cornell and the Good Fire. On the night of February 8th, 1673, Thomas Cornell rushed into the sitting room where he had earlier left his mother, Rebecca Cornell. On the floor, he found a body badly burned. He said he suspected he'd found a drunken Indian who had fallen into the fire. But as he rushed close, he declared, "Oh Lord, it is my mother." And so began the strange case of the murder of Rebecca Cornell. The Cornells were a well-respected family in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. Thomas and Rebecca, originally from England, ran an inn in Boston. They left Massachusetts in the wake of Anne Hutchinson's expulsion for her religious beliefs. The Cornells sympathized with the more tolerant society Roger Williams was creating in Rhode Island. Thomas Sr. died in 1655. Both Thomas Cornells, Sr. and Jr., were well-regarded citizens, serving public office. By 1673, Rebecca had entrusted her estate to her son Thomas. On the day she died, Thomas spent more than an hour talking with his mother in her sitting room. Then he was called to dinner. The evening dinner was salt mackerel, which Rebecca did not eat. She said it made her dry in the night. Sounds disgusting.
Right. Salt mackerel.
Yeah, I'll just get Wendy's, thanks.
No, thanks. I'm allergic.
This was at least 100 years before the first Wendy's.
At least 100 years. Wendy's wouldn't arrive for some time.
Okay.
Do you remember the time you did the experiment with which was better, McDonald's, Burger King, or Wendy's, like way back in the day? I think for maybe even it was for a school project.
I did?
Yeah, dude. You like compared the fries, you compared all the milkshakes, who had the better who had the better fries, who had the better burgers. I think you got burgers, nuggets, fries, and milkshakes.
Oh shit.
You don't remember that?
No.
What? I think about that. I talk about that all the time. They're like, kids.
Who had the best stuff though?
I don't remember. I think I think Burger King had the best fries. I think McDonald's. Yeah, like I do remember that. I think McDonald's had the best milkshake.
Milkshake? Probably Wendy's. I don't like I've never been a fan of McDonald's. It's always been overpriced. It's always oh yeah. I mean, even among fast food, like the lowest common denominator, like I just always felt like McDonald's is hot garbage. Burger King, I'll do occasionally. Like Wendy's, I'll do occasionally. Wendy's is a jam with the Frosties too. You got
right. I do love their salads. I like that they have the salads. Really, I can't believe you don't remember that. Anyway.
All right. Well,
moving right along.
Yeah. We'll jump back to the story. All right, salt mackerel. Thomas sent his son Edward to ask Rebecca if she wanted boiled milk or some other supper. As Edward tried to rouse his grandmother, he was alarmed by a dog bounding from the sitting room. Something was amiss, and Edward ran to fetch a candle and raise an alarm. When Thomas returned to the sitting room with Edward, he found the body on the floor. Kneeling down, Thomas first tried some Indian phrases to communicate with the injured person. On closer inspection, he recognized his mother. The first coroner's inquest was quick and to the point. Rebecca Cornell had died in a fire. She had probably fallen asleep, dropped ash from her pipe on herself, and burned to death. But 4 days after the death, Rebecca's brother John, gave a strange testimony. He was asleep in bed, and he felt something heave up the bedclothes twice, and thought somebody had been coming to bed with him. But once upon he awaked, and turned himself about in his bed, and being turned, he perceived a light in the room, like to the dawning of the day, and plainly saw the shape and appearance of a woman standing by his bedside, whereat he was much affrighted, and he cried out, "In the name of God, what are you?" "What art thou?" Sorry.
Whoops.
Old English. Sometimes I just want to talk like that, but nobody seems to get it. Anyways.
You should do it anyway.
Nobody's on my fucking level. The apparition answered, "I am your sister, Cornell," and twice said, "See how I was burnt with fire." And she plainly appeared unto him to be very much burnt about the shoulders, face, and head. The vision reinvigorated the investigation. Rebecca's brother interpreted the vision to mean that his sister accused someone of burning her intentionally. Rebecca's body was inspected a second time, and this jury found a suspicious wound in her stomach. A new version of events began to take shape, and Thomas Cornell was charged with murdering his mother.
I mean, from the beginning, I find this story like suspicious. You know what I mean? Like the dog ran out. He sends his kid up to, how old is this son Edward? Does it, as he tries to rouse his grandmother, he's alarmed by the dog. Like, was he in there or not? Like, it's very interesting, and it seems suspicious from the get go. The way that like Thomas is acting, like he finds the body, like doesn't realize it's his own mother. Like it's just, I don't know. And I know that it's not all here. I've read elsewhere about the testimony and like the circumstances that why they say they thought it was an Indian, and things like that. But it's just very interesting, and definitely suspicious, like on its face. But
Yeah.
no, that's right now. That's my only comment.
Okay. All right.
Because then you get into what they talk about at trial is even more compelling, if you will.
Yeah, I'm going to read that little bit there, and then we'll discuss some more. So, at trial, witnesses painted an unpleasant picture of life in the Cornell home. Rebecca Cornell had complained about her treatment. She had to work on the farm. She went to bed without her bed made up or warmed. And she complained that Thomas was skimpy in heating the home and would not provide a good fire. Her son declined to hire a maid to look after her, and she and Thomas argued over whether rent should be paid for staying at the house and whether he should pay her or vice versa. Rebecca Cornell, 2 witnesses testified, had contemplated killing herself, either by stabbing herself or drowning herself. Further, she had told some she planned to leave Thomas's house and move in with her son Samuel in the spring. Of particular concern to Rebecca, Thomas's second wife, Sarah, who she disliked. Patience Cogshell testified she was afraid that there would be mischief done. Her daughter-in-law was of such a desperate spirit, for not long since, said she ran after one of the children of his first wife with an axe into her house, but she prevented her striking the child. Yet she did not live with any of her other children. She had made over her estate to her son Thomas. If she had thought her son Thomas' first wife would have died before her, she would not have made it over to him. Other witnesses questioned Thomas's story about his mother refusing mackerel, charging that she had been known to eat it. John Pierce suggested Thomas Cornell was glad his mother was gone. He testified. Thomas Cornell said that his mother in her lifetime had a desire to have a good fire, and further said that he thought God had answered her ends, for now she had it.
Jeez, savage.
What? The jury convicted Thomas Cornell of murdering his mother with virtually no evidence that he had done so. 2 years after he died on the gallows, his widow Sarah was charged with assisting in the murder, along with a local Indian. She was not convicted. However, the case of Rebecca Cornell caused the people of Rhode Island to debate whether spectral evidence should be used in criminal cases at all. Yeah, like people are debating about this. Like that's what?
Well, yeah, I guess in the later on in the witch trials, it was actually while it was used, it wasn't fully supported. A lot of people were like, "This isn't cool. Like, this doesn't make any sense." Even one of the was it Increase Mather was the one. You know how there's Cotton Mather, and I think it was his father. He also said, this it would better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person be condemned. He denounced the use of spectral evidence. Like, so as far as like this story,
who is Cotton Mather exactly? He was like I'm not sure.
Oh gosh, so Cotton Mather, so Increase Mather, who I was just talking about. These, let me look this up.
I know the name. I can't remember what he was famous for.
He was a minister in Boston.
He was a minister. Okay, gotcha.
Hold on.
Yeah, Cotton Mather. Yeah.
Cotton Mather was a Puritan clergyman and author in colonial New England, and he wrote a bunch of books. Increase Mather was his father, and they kind of did the same stuff. Like I'm pretty sure Increase Mather was also a minister. Sorry, I don't have all my history prepared. I wasn't prepared to answer that question. And I don't like to say things that aren't true. So, but yeah, Cotton Mather was a Puritan minister, clergy in Massachusetts. So, yeah, so like it's not as if, and even in Boston or Salem when they did the trials, like they created a whole new court to hear. Like Governor Phipps, he went to England, he comes back with a charter. And back in the day, there was always things were changing because the way that it worked was like somebody would get funded in England or the Netherlands or France or wherever. They would get funding from a company to come over to the New World and start a colony for the company and, start trading and start, whatever. So before there were states, there were colonies, and like by the time in Massachusetts, like there was the Plymouth Bay colony, but then there was also I'm forgetting the names exactly, but like Plymouth was its own colony, and also Boston was its own colony, but they weren't Massachusetts yet. So like every time a new colony came up, there would be like this alliance, and these guys, the such and such blah blah blah, was uniting together to form this alliance. And then so like there was all sorts of issues with that. And then let's not even get into the Native Americans that were there, and some got land properly, some didn't, whatever. So like I don't mean whatever like it's not important, but there was so much going on. So Governor Phipps goes to England. He comes back with a charter, and he creates a new court. When he came back, there were so many people being accused of witchcraft. They were backlogged in the jails, and they had to be dealt with. So he creates this new court just for that, and that's where they heard normally this wouldn't really happen with the spectral evidence. So, and by the time they ended it very quickly, and like I said before, once his wife got accused, and once that happened, things went away. And I think
Yep.
the thing I see with this is like, now I'm not saying that Brother John did not have a dream where his sister came to him and said, look, somebody killed me. Maybe they knew. I mean, clearly people had all these ideas in the trial that like she wasn't being treated well, and that's crazy about the wife. The second wife went after a kid with an axe.
Yeah.
Like, goodness gracious, what? There's actually a similar story from Vermont, but the kid actually was murdered by the stepmom. It's an awful story. I don't remember the names, but
Jeez.
this guy,
Debbie
yeah,
Down
like
over here.
I know. Well, I've read a lot of. There's a lot of crazy stories out of Vermont. I mean, there's crazy stories out of everywhere, but Vermont has some darkness.
I feel like what those freaking those hillbillies go all crazy up in the woods.
I do.
Solitude gets to them.
Interestingly, Sam just texted me and said there's a fire. He's kidding, and I'm like, why are you doing this? But we're talking about fires. So I think that maybe, again, not saying he didn't have a dream, but maybe there was not enough evidence. But they had to come up with some way, knowing that, what was that movie where Al Pacino's a cop and he knows the guy did it, but he didn't have enough evidence, so he planted something to get the guy convicted. Where he was in Alaska. What's the name of that with Robin Williams?
Oh, Insomnia.
Insomnia. Yeah.
Crazy.
Yes. Yeah. So I wonder if it's like a situation like that with this particular case. Like, they know there was issues. They know she wasn't being treated well, because in back in the day, these were small towns. It's not like
Yeah.
there were a lot of people, and there
Keep
was
in mind, this is pre-colonial America. This is pre-constitutional republic America.
right.
Like, if you read through some of the things like we established this country with, some of the legal principles, like right to due process, right to
Mm-hmm.
speedy trial, right to a jury, all these things. This is prior to that. So like, I'm curious, like what's the legal history there? Are we still we're probably still largely operating under British law at that point. You know what I
At
mean?
this point,
At the
oh
point of
yeah,
the witch trials and Rebecca Cornell, they're about the same. Because we're still 1692 would be the witch trials. We have the Constitution as we know it, just about 100 years later.
right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
so
this is well before that.
yeah, we're still pre-revolution. This is very new. Like, at this point in 1672, I believe we have the King Philip's War is happening.
Oh
I'm
yeah,
gonna
that
double
I'm not
check.
sure the years on that. Yeah, look, you
No,
look
it
at.
was
I hear key.
75 to 76. My bad. So 1675 to 76 is King Philip's War.
That was only a year.
What's that?
That was only a year.
Yeah,
Really?
yeah. King Philip's War specifically was very short, but very very deadly. Oh
Yeah.
gosh, I could talk for days about King Philip's War.
No, we need to have a
Um,
whole podcast episode about that.
we need to have like
Probably
several.
multiple. And then
But
yeah, I want to do I want to do a video series about King Philip's War because it seems like there's a
yeah,
lot going on, or even just like the native wars in that time period.
yeah, because there was a lot for like
I thought that spanned several years, even decades. Oh,
it's decades. Yeah, if because King Philip's War was just one singular. Um, I don't want to call it one singular war, but like kind of. It was a number of skirmishes in a time period that ended when ultimately when King Philip was killed. but
Yeah.
that wasn't the first, and that wasn't the end. I mean,
Right. Right.
initially they say, there was some semblance of peace, but um, after that first generation of settlers and um, it's hard to nutshell this because there's so much misinformation about the early days of America that, like, every time I go to say something, I'm like, yeah, but no, there was more. But I don't want to get into all of that right now. But long story short, like, this was in a time period where, like, you know these colonies were new, these towns were new, um these people were new to this area still. This is less than 100 years after European contact. Like, ultimately, there's been contact for years, but ultimately, Plymouth was 1620 or so. So
Yep.
yeah, as far as the law, you're still very much under English law, but it's also because you're not in England. It's like I guess it's easier to run amok in a way. You know what I mean? It's not to say there weren't, like, the ministers or whoever that were in charge of things, or the governors who went by the books, or whatever authority there was, but this, I do think it's crazy that this guy was executed on the basis of a dream. Like that this is like unheard of. Like, this would never fly
So
in court today.
now, where was he executed?
I think he was hung at Miantonomi Hill in Newport.
Really? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because people say that area is haunted too.
Yeah, they do. Well, okay, so the area where there's a couple little things about this story that I find interesting. First of all, learning that the Cornells were founding family of Portsmouth. They were there in the very early days. Not only
Yeah.
that, but if you know the story of Anne Hutchinson very famously was um, exiled from Massachusetts and went on to go to Portsmouth. And she's there's a park in Portsmouth and Founders Brook Motel. I don't know if you know about that place at the top of Portsmouth, is because of the original area where the founders of Portsmouth. So, but
Right.
she's famous in Rhode Island history and New England history. 2 years after that happened, she went to New York with a couple of other families, the Cornells included, and she ended up dying. Her and her entire family, Anne Hutchinson, was massacred by Native Americans in New York. This was New York was also at this time, I believe it was New Amsterdam, and it was still very, very new, very, very new world sort of stuff. The Cornells were on a neighboring farm, they lost everything, but they escaped with themselves and their 8 children. So,
Goodness.
yeah, I know, 8 kids. um, I just, so first of all, like, I didn't know that. I've known about this story forever, and I didn't know that. I mean, can you imagine that by itself is a majorly traumatic event?
Oh
Like,
yeah.
right? Like, 8 kids. I mean, and then back then, I forget what year she was born. I think she was born in 1600. So in 1640, some odd, was when this happened. She's, well, maybe the kids were older, but still, like, that's got to be like, you managed to escape, like, a massacre, like, so that has to leave an imprint on the family. So they returned to Portsmouth. I guess they were both illiterate, which is interesting, but not uncommon for the time. Um, and I read in a article that Thomas Cornell is an ancestor of Lizzie Borden.
Oh wow.
Right? Like, so I put all these things together and I'm just like, damn. It's just interesting. And
That's another New England case I want to read up a little on because
right.
it just seems odd. Like I don't know all the details, but there's just something interesting about the case. Like she should have been convicted. Like we have this, I don't want to compare it to the Salem witch trials, and just I want to I want to look into those like court documents a little bit more. But
Mm.
I also don't know how that was recorded back then, hundreds of years ago.
Well, these and even this story, which is predates that by 200 years, they have fairly decent transcripts or I'm not sure what they would be called back then, but court documents from this trial still exist in Newport records. Newport has a good amount of records. It's actually fascinating to go through the court records. But
Yeah.
yeah, so
So
yeah,
where
I mean,
is this? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
Is this house still standing?
So this house is not standing to my understanding. um, I believe there's a restaurant in Portsmouth called the Valley Inn. West is it West Main Road? Um, we've all seen it. So I think the original farmhouse burned down in 1889, and it was rebuilt using the same plans, but it wasn't clearly the same house. In 1957, the property became the Valley Inn restaurant. Um, and it's said that that area is the inn is haunted. It has a lot of things happen. I guess most notably, one is a bottle got thrown across the bar room on on its own. I think that's the most notable experience. And I imagine there's probably more going on there, but so yeah, like apparently the the building in the area is haunted, and there's been other. Uh,
Yeah, I've heard that about that place.
yeah, and I've driven by that quite a bit.
Is that an actual restaurant? Like,
I don't know if currently I don't know what it's doing. I've never seen it in operation myself. That doesn't mean it hasn't been. I know some people who work there years back, but I don't know
oh,
what it's doing right now.
any stories from that?
Yeah. So I guess there's, at the back of the property, there's the cemetery where Rebecca Cornell is buried. Um,
Oh, okay.
and they're unsure of where Thomas Cornell is buried. Again, this is so, I mean, it's fascinating to me, but like, again, this is virtually unheard of today. Like anything like this, the closest thing I've seen to this is repressed memories. In using repressed memories for, I've seen this in The Keepers on Netflix. I don't think it's still on Netflix, but it was about a woman going against a Catholic priest in Baltimore for she suddenly remembered things that she had repressed, and she used that in court to sue a Catholic priest who had abused her in high school. It's a really triggering, insane story, but that's the closest I've ever heard of anything like that being used. Now, granted, she didn't, to my understanding, she was not successful in that lawsuit because she didn't have enough evidence.
Right.
So, like, so this is the thing, like, even in Salem, how it boggles my mind as coming from 2025 as a person who has a decent understanding of the law that any of this is admissible in court in any situation. And like specifically the Salem witch trials always really pissed me off because it's like you have these girls putting on this. I always looked at it like this is like this show, like this is this dramatic show to to accuse somebody of something that it's almost like, I don't know what are nowadays there are things you can accuse people of that is hard to come back from, like any sort of like, sexual harassment or assault is, once you're accused of that, even if you're innocent, it's very hard to come back. So, like back in the day, is it the same thing with witchcraft? Like in Puritan New England, was it the same kind of thing? You know what I'm saying? And I see even nowadays how like the court of public opinion is a very real thing. And I was actually just watching a podcast about how does the court of public opinion actually factor into a court of law? And this person is raising a question about people who are actually wrongfully accused of, sexual assault and things like that because of the court of public opinion. So I think of all these things like nowadays that, people are so hell bent on their opinions with polarizing topics in life, in the world, and whatever's going on. I'm not going to get into what they are, but there are people who doggedly hold on to a viewpoint, and they swear they're right. They swear it's true. Nothing could be, nothing will change their opinion. But when you really look at the facts, it's the complete opposite of what they're saying. Do you know what I'm saying? Like if you actually go and there's certain recent court cases where I watch a lot of court cases because I really enjoy understanding what's going on in the courtroom, right? Like what actually happened? What does the document actually say? What are the source documents? These kinds of things. So like I'm always looking for that answer. I could give a crap less what, so and so thinks of such and such a topic. It's like I'm interested in the facts and the data. What do the facts and the data say? And it's very often completely different from what the you know I'm trying to like nutshell this, but like it's very often different. So I wonder if like during these situations, like for example with the witch trials, like they use this hysteria to stir up these emotions in people to get them to back them in their in their accusations. And they use the spectral evidence because they had nothing else. You know what I'm saying? Like there's nothing else. Once they stopped allowing spectral evidence in court, they stopped. The trial stopped, the accusation stopped. And I'm not saying they never occurred again, but like, in other parts of New England, because there are other, witch scares and things throughout history. But like, if this stuff is still happening now, who's like, why would it not have happened then too? In a society like human nature is human nature. Do you know what I'm saying? So I don't know. I look on this and I'm like, Salem witch trials always they piss me off. And this story is a little different because like you can look at it like on the one hand, without that dream, this guy would have gotten away with it. But then what if he didn't actually do it? All you have is the dream.
Yeah, seriously, that's crazy. That's crazy to me. Well, again, I
Yeah.
mean, part of it's like the law and the courts, like at that time, were something different than what they are today, and
That's true.
even the courts today, without this whole other conversation, it's time for this podcast, but like even the courts today are so perverted, and they're not even supposed to be what they're supposed. They don't even do what they're supposed to do a lot of times. So it's like
Yeah, there's
the whole
that
other
too.
conversation. But I'm just saying, like, this is even before like our country was
Modern day.
based on these laws that are
Right.
fair to people. So prior to that, it's like a whole other thing. I mean, there's a lot of I don't know much about I only know like bits and pieces about this stuff, but I know that even so what are we at 1600s, late 1600s, so like 400 some years, almost 500 years prior to this was the Magna Carta, and a couple of the tenets of the Magna Carta were a speedy trial. You can't just be like have your house like raided and taken, like you can't have your property seized, and you can't I won't say you can't be accused of something without evidence. I don't know, just like basic legal concepts. And I'm like, we're even somewhere between that and then 500 years later, we're like burning people with spectral evidence. It's like
Oh,
there's some
shit.
obvious flaws. I'm not entirely sure what I'm trying to say to like explain it to people who are listening. I'm just kind of trying to understand like where we were at versus like where we were 100 years after, and then today.
Right. Well,
But
that's what I'm saying is like there's that human nature thing that we still do to this day.
well, and then the other thing I was going to say though was like, what if I don't? I'm wondering what the I think this is the kind of thing like you didn't like somebody, you do something like this to them, and you had some sort of power to like pull those
Mhm.
levers. You know what I mean? Like, what's
Right.
the underlying reason? Like, what's the reason for the spectral evidence in um, the Salem witch trials? You know what I mean? It's just it's baffling to me because even with what like the legal systems that exist at the time, it's just like I've ne- is like was this common prior? You know what I mean? Even if
Well,
even if we're talking like in terms of British law, because I'm assuming it's like we probably were heavily based on that prior to our own constitution, um, and maybe there were some like I'm just kind of speculating. I'm assuming it would be a lot like that, and maybe we had some local ordinances that were slightly different, but it would be a lot different than what it was once the United States was officially established.
right. Well, yeah, and you got to think like
But
on
was that
paper.
but was that sort of thing is that common? Like do we say like, oh, this is fine, like someone had a fucking dream, they said you're the devil, you got to go, like,
Right.
you know what I mean?
Well, I did on that note like a couple things about Salem and this whole thing is there is a theory, and again I don't want to get all into Salem because there's so much there,
Sure,
but they
but we
do.
can touch on it. We gave the
Yeah,
disclaimer. Where
I
this
mean
isn't
we
about
are.
Salem. This is about spectral evidence. We're talking about spectral evidence and like how that relates. So part of that is going to cross into Salem. But go ahead.
There is a theory that there was a bad crop of, I believe it was rye. I'm not 100%, but one of the crops that year was bad. It had some kind of mold in it that actually caused hallucinations. That's one of the theories that I've heard, is that that's how this actually started. I've seen arguments for and against that, but in that case, maybe they really were seeing these things. You know what I'm saying? Maybe they really, or at least if you're under the influence of uh, a mold that makes you hallucinate, maybe you actually think these things are happening.
Yeah,
You know
and
what I mean? So
it creates a mass hysteria. I mean,
right,
you're talking about essentially a very small town at the time. I mean, what was the
right.
population? A few hundred or something?
Well, yeah. Well, back then there was Salem, and then there was Salem Town, and one of them is now Danvers, I believe, or Beverly.
Yeah.
Again, I don't have all my facts in line, but yeah, the names of places were a little different back then too, because they hadn't fully, um, come together to where they are now. But in that case, yeah, you got to think like these are towns they weren't in Boston, they weren't even the bigger town, they were on the outskirts, and there was hostilities between local tribes. There was issues there. At King the Salem witch trials are not super long after the King Philip's War, which was it was a huge thing. I mean, it was that was so you got to think like the paranoia is probably high on its own. Then you've got the religious paranoia of, oh my god, uh, such and such town was burned, God's punishing us, or like people being afraid of what's beyond town. Like it was a very wild and hostile situation. Um, so those things all have to factor in, and like if you're, and this is kind of why I say with like why I mention what happened to Anne Hutchinson and the family escaping, like like that's trauma imprinted on people that did they have an understanding of those things back then, and like to be able to talk about it, like treatment of mental health over the years, that's another topic that we're going to definitely be discussing in a future episode. But the treatment of mental health throughout the years, even going back to England, is definitely, we're just going to say, been lacking. So if these people are going through, like any people, any people, I'm being very general about the population of New England at that time. But if they're going through these things that they're repressed in a lot of ways, there's are they talking about their feelings and experiences? Like so like these things, they go through families and they imprint on you, and they actually generational trauma is passed down generation to generation. And that's why I mentioned that they say uh, he's the I don't know how, but he's a ancestor of Lizzie Borden. Does that have any bearing? You know what I'm saying? Like, that's a sidebar, but like, so if these people are really going through this intense internal shit, what are they actually seeing? Is there malice there? Are they hallucinating? There's also another theory that some of these people had property that other people wanted. Like that's definitely come up. There
it is. Yep.
Like, if if you're in power and you can pull strings in a way, and you're of the character to do something like that, people do stuff like that all the time. So nowadays people screw other people over, and they're two-faced, and they try to do
Yeah, it's very possible. It's very possible, because that's what I'm saying, is like, what's the reasoning for, like, what's the cause for this, like, mass legal exception? You know what I mean, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Like, unless we're saying, because it would have to be like, this is standard, or like, there's a reason for this to happen. You know what I mean? Do you follow my logic
Right.
with that? Like,
Yeah, right.
it doesn't seem like it's a normal, like, court procedure, or like a trial procedure in any way. So it's just like, I wonder what the origin is, as far as, like, I don't want to speculate and say, oh, it was because they had land people wanted, but I'm like, that's one thing you could say, is like, what, it's probably something like that.
Right.
That's what I tend to think. You know what I mean? Because it just doesn't make sense otherwise. Like, oh, I saw this person in a dream talking to the devil, like, okay. And then, that it seems like, I guess even before that, there was so in '92 with the Salem, and then I suppose I with the Cornell case 20 years prior. Like, what else have you seen, like, in the area, like Rhode Island, Massachusetts? Like, have you seen other cases like this, or like?
I mean, I haven't heard of any besides these two.
Right.
Doesn't mean that they didn't happen. I mean, the Salem witch trials is obviously like one of the biggest ones, and even when I look it up, I don't see anything else except for Salem.
Right.
And I don't even know how I know about the Rebecca Cornell story. Like, I heard of that like decades ago. I mean, so long ago. Yeah, it seems like that's at least the greatest hits is the let me see, because I'm not finding anything beyond, like, I'm Google searching it right now just because. Yeah, and the only thing that comes up in Google is Salem. So like, I'm sure if I did like a deep dive into spectral evidence in colonial New England, I could find more examples of it. But I don't think, I think it's one of those things that I think it was used and accepted in court, clearly, but I don't think it was like the norm. I think, just as we're sitting here, like, and I'm like, the Salem witch trials pissed me off. Obviously, there must have been people back then who felt the same way. Like, there's a lot of stuff in history that I always think of Braveheart, where he says history is written by the victors or something like that. So like history is often written from one viewpoint where there's so much more when you look under the surface. So,
oh yeah,
you know what I'm saying? So it's, there was probably everything I've read mentions that spectral evidence it's not the norm. It's controversial like every time. So I'm sure back then, like there were probably just like there are today. There's the camp of critical thinkers who's like, okay, I'm going to take what's in front of me and I'm going to think about it. I'm going to get other evidence, other opinions, and I'm going to form a opinion based on, fact or consensus or, whatever like that. But then you also have your, you know, hysteria driven
yeah,
folk who don't look at that and they're just like pitchforks, like maybe not literally, but like in the emotion of pitchforks. So I think while there were definitely some people who bought it, there were also some people who were like, you can't do this. Like, this ain't cool. Like, how do we know he killed her? Like, I'm sure both things were true.
yeah, no kidding.
So, as far as this particular story I mean, when you look at like the facts that we see here about apparently the people testifying, um, about how she wasn't treated well and she never would have put it in his name if he had knew he was going to get remarried. Like when you look at all that stuff together, it's like, maybe he did do it and he deserved it. And I wonder why the widow was not convicted though. I'm curious about that. This I don't know. I don't know much more about it, but so yeah, I don't know. Interesting. It's just interesting. I think human nature is. It's interesting to me to see human nature. I think a lot of people do things like, they'll take a whole group of people, like um, all teachers are bad, or all men are bad, or
All cops are bastards.
all cops are bad, whatever it is, right? But the reality is that in every situation, in every group, you have people that are good and you have people that are not so good, or you have people that are moral and people that are not. And that goes for every single group of people. In a group of political people, there's going to be, the ones that are moral and the ones that are not. Like it doesn't matter. And it's not about the label. It's not about what the person's doing for their job or, where they are in life. It's just, this is how human nature is. It's a human nature question. So like, I think once we can get past that and like understand that, like take people for what they like, their actions and how they are, as opposed to, what the opinion is, I think we'll be much better off.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed.
Yeah, so spectral evidence in pre-colonial New England.
Yeah, it's fucking horrifying.
It kind of is. To think like, 20 people were put to death because of it. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, and I mean,
they say that the what's the house? The my brain. It's not that I don't know this. It's that my brain is broken. Hold on. It's a famous house, and it's the
House of Seven Gables.
No.
The Hocus Pocus house.
It is Corwin. I'm like, see. They say that his house, let me find it, get it in front of my eyeballs. I think Samuel, is it Samuel Corwin? Intermission. Do 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 do. Really, does it have to be at the bottom of the list? Oh my God, where is it? George Corwin. Where is it? Hold on. Pause.
Pause.
Why am I having issues with this?
Bro, I don't
What?
know.
What is my? Oh, okay. Oh, it's not the core. Okay, it's the Joshua Ward House in Salem. Um, okay, the house was built in 1784 on the site of Sheriff George Corwin's property. George Corwin was the High Sheriff of Essex County during the Salem witch trials and signed warrants for arrest and execution of those convicted of witchcraft. So they say that that house, so we're not going to get into this now, but that house is incredibly haunted because of the sheriff who signed all those warrants and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
That's a famous thing, I guess. So it's interesting. I just find it's interesting how these things just pass down. And when you go to Salem today and you go to Newport today, I don't know, they're still very historical and they have a lot of. I'm going to end with this note. I love going to Newport and being in Newport because it is so historical, and you can feel. It's almost like you can feel the footprints of everybody who's been there before you.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like going back, like it's there. Like the town is like it's like it wears the history. Do you know what I'm saying? And like Salem is very similar to that. It's not all bad. I mean, but there's definitely been a lot of shit. Like this murder happened on Aquidneck Island. These executions happened. Did you know that you can't? They don't know, for example, where this guy's even buried. They're not sure which grave is even Rebecca's, and they don't even know the exact location of the gallows in Salem. So as much as like the history's there, like they don't even. There
Yeah.
are some things unaccounted for, which it's all fascinating to me. It's fascinating. I rest my case.
Your Honor.
Like I said, as we're doing this, all I can think of is A Few Good Men. Doesn't matter what I know, matters what I can prove. I think of that with the spectral evidence. Like, I know we did it, but I can't prove it. So I had a dream. Just like insomnia, it's possible.
It's possible. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.